we'll start with this. Well, the Premier Boxing Champion's Twitter account posted this, and it reads, lots of talent in the welterweight division for Errol Spence Jr. Who do you want to see him in the ring next? And you'll notice in the graphic that, once again, Terence Crawford is absent. They've featured anyone from Mikey Garcia to Danny Garcia, who Errol just beat, to Keith Thurman, to Yordenis Ugas, to Josecito Lopez.
Right.
People over there at Fox and the PBC, I guess, feel that Mikey Garcia and Josecito Lopez are worth mentioning, more so than Terence Crawford, because he's
excluded.
Not here, he's not in the image. And I found this graphic quite curious because it's pretty obvious that the people over there at Fox and the PBC place no value, no emphasis on a Terence Crawford fight. Yet it was a PBC employee, a company man, in Marcos Villegas that just the other day took to Twitter to ask the boxing fans, hey, what's a bigger fight? Fury versus Joshua or Spence versus Crawford? And, you know, the answer to that question is quite obvious.
Fury versus Joshua.
Anybody who follows the sport of boxing and has a functioning brain cell would know the answer to that question, so it leaves one left to wonder, why would Marcos ask such a redundant and asinine question? What the hell were Errol Spence Jr.'s pay-per-view numbers? 250,000 buys? Terence Crawford, God bless him, he's no pay-per-view attraction.
So how are you comparing those two fights?
Why are you even comparing those two fights? When the answer to that question is quite obvious.
Like, what are you, an idiot?
I'll tell you something. There is a reason that Marcos Villegas asked this very asinine and redundant question. There is. And
we're going to talk about that shortly.
We'll get to that. But before we cover all of those bases, what I'd like to know is, if this fight is comparable to Joshua versus Fury in terms of size, in terms of scale, in terms of fan reaction and significance, if this Crawford versus Spence fight is on the level with that Joshua versus Fury fight, why is it that Marcos Villegas' employer doesn't seem to think so? Think about it for a second. They don't care enough about Terence Crawford to feature him in any of their graphics. They're not promoting a Crawford versus Spence fight, right?
Right.
Fox executive and PBC liaison Bill Wenger, in so many words, said they don't even recognize the WBO as an organization. They don't recognize the WBO title. They only recognize the WBA, the WBC, and the IBF. So, if the people over there at Fox, they don't place any emphasis on the Crawford versus Spence fight, Errol Spence Jr. himself, he doesn't seem to place much emphasis on that fight either.
Neither do Errol's fans.
They really don't. I mean, at this point, these guys would sooner support a Spence versus Thurman fight, a Spence versus Ugas fight. Hell, I think they'd even support a Spence versus Josecito Lopez fight before they'd get behind a Crawford fight. They have advocated against that fight and have been advocating against that fight throughout. If nobody on the PBC side of the fence places any emphasis on the Crawford versus Spence Jr. fight, why the fuck would it be on the level with Fury versus Joshua in terms of size, in terms of scale, in terms of significance?
Why?
What rock is Marcos Villegas living under that he thinks those two fights are comparable? There's an equal demand from both Tyson Fury's fans and Anthony Joshua's fans for a fight between them, regardless of who you think wins the fight and regardless of who you're a fan of. Both sides of the argument, both sides of the aisle, have agreed on one thing. They want to see that fight. Whereas in the case of Crawford versus Spence Jr., Spence and his fans, you know, they seem happy entertaining alternatives to a Terence Crawford fight. The demand for that fight is nowhere near as great as the demand for Fury versus Joshua. Those two fights ain't even comparable.
Then why'd Marcos ask such a stupid fucking question?
Well, it's because the PBC's not invited to that party.
What?
That's right. That's why. When it comes to Fury versus Joshua, that event, as big as it is, ain't got a goddamn fucking thing to do with no PBC fighters.
Okay.
They ain't got a pony in that show. What pony they had in the heavyweight division, Deontay Wilder, he's been cut out of the picture, at least for now. All the talk in the heavyweight division revolves around Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury. That party. And that's a party that the PBC, they ain't invited to. So the most they can do in that situation,
to try and stay relevant,
they'll bring up a fight they have no intention of making, because at least when it comes to that fight does feature one of their boys, one of their PBC fighters. The Errol Spence Jr. versus Terrence Crawford fight. They'll dangle the fans by bringing up that fight as if they're actually getting behind it when we all know they're not. But they'll bring that fight up as a retrospect to a Fury versus Joshua fight, because when it comes to Fury and Joshua, you guys ain't invited to that party. And that fight will monopolize the vast majority of the boxing fans' attention for the next couple of weeks and months, in all the ways that your PBC cards do not. Look at the Charlo doubleheader numbers. Look at Gervonta Davis's pay-per-view numbers. Look at Errol Spence Jr.'s pay-per-view numbers.
Not a single one cracked 300,000 buys.
Not a single one. And it's because the fight fans ain't interested in those fights. That's what I've been trying to tell you. Don't let the tweets on Twitter or the videos on YouTube fool you into thinking that those fights and those fighters are more relevant than what they are. The paying public, they're not interested in Davis versus Santa Cruz or Spence versus Garcia, Mikey Garcia or Danny Garcia. They're not interested in those fights.
Nope.
What fights they are interested in are the fights that the PBC don't want to make. It's the funniest thing, because, PBC's programming and what spin doctors are associated with them, they appeal to a demographic that does not actually contribute to the sport of boxing itself. Contribute financially. Finance, the lifeblood of the sport. You one of these guys you see on Twitter talking up the latest PBC pay-per-view, the latest PBC shit show. You one of these guys. Do you actually think these guys are paying $80 5 times a year to watch this stuff? Fuck no!
No way.
These guys are firing up their fire sticks and their crack streams. That's how they're watching these pay-per-views. It's easy for those guys to talk them up because they're not actually consumers. They watch these fights by way of illegal streams. So when this is the kind of demographic that you appeal to, you're only going to get so far. Your pay-per-view numbers, they're only going to get so far because the public that you appeal to isn't the paying public. Why do you think the Charlo doubleheader only got a little over 100,000 buys? Why do you think Gervonta Davis's big pay-per-view debut didn't even crack 250,000? And why do you think that Errol Spence Jr.'s numbers are starting to nosedive? Where he debuted on pay-per-view at roughly 360,000 buys, now he's at 250,000.
Man, that's if he even hit that.
Because, word around the campfire seems to be that these guys are actually fudging those numbers. They're exaggerating them. They're rounding up, essentially, that these pay-per-views aren't selling as much as they'd have you believe. That's what the story is. That's what the word is around the water cooler. Word is around the rumor mill.
That's it.
Paying public. The paying public, sick of this crap, sick of these shenanigans from the PBC, and they're not going for it, The only ones endorsing the PBC's antics are guys who don't even buy pay-per-views.
Bums.
They'll never tell you that themselves. They won't. But hey, if these guys were half as popular as their supporters would have you believe, you tell me why none of them could crack 300,000 buys. You tell me where Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. can stage an exhibition match and bring in over 1 million pay-per-view buys, where the UFC, those guys and whatever they decide to put on, they haven't missed a beat. They've gotten some very generous numbers on pay-per-view last couple of months as well. The PBC kids, not so much. I'm telling you. It's not that these guys are watching illegal streams that chaps my ass. I could care less how these fucking guys watch a fight. It's that they spend night and day arguing about how fucking great the PBC's programming is when, it can't be all that great if you don't want to fucking pay for it. You guys are their biggest supporters. You don't even want to buy their fucking fights. But you want to argue with me about the shit?
That's what gets me.
These guys, they'll sit there and argue with you for hours on end, 24 hours a day on social media about how all these fucking PBC guys, they're all pay-per-view stars. They're all marquee attractions. They just can't seem to attract you fucking guys to spend any kind of money.
Well, that's because they ain't marquee attractions.
Not big ones. And, those cards, a good number of them, they're not pay-per-view worthy. They're just not. So we come back to Marcos Villegas' asinine question. What's a bigger fight? Crawford versus Spence or Fury versus Joshua? He asks this question when what he should be asking himself is, if the Crawford versus Spence fight is as big as the Fury versus Joshua fight, why don't your employers seem to think so? Never mind me, I'm Captain Obvious. I know that those two fights ain't on the same level or the same stratosphere. I know that, but never mind me. If Marcos Villegas thinks so much of Crawford versus Spence that he thinks it's anywhere near on the same level as Fury versus Joshua, what he should be asking himself is, why his employer doesn't share that opinion. Why doesn't Errol Spence Jr. or Errol Spence Jr.'s fans, why don't they share that opinion? Since he thinks so fucking much of the fight that he puts it on the same level, the same neighborhood as Fury versus Joshua. That's what he should be asking. Yeah, Marcos, he's a PBC company man. He's gonna do this kind of goofy stuff, you know? He actually tried to throw shade at the Canelo Alvarez versus Callum Smith fight. Talked about that in my previous video. Starts going on about how, either Caleb Plant or David Benavidez would be favored to beat Callum Smith. He's trying to throw shade at that guy, trying to throw shade at the fight, because that's a fight that don't feature no PBC fighters, don't feature any of the PBC stable of super middleweights. He's throwing shade at that guy. He goes as far as saying that, even though Callum Smith, in all the divisional rank standings, even though Callum is ranked ahead of both Caleb Plant and David Benavidez, the ranks themselves, they don't mean anything.
You know what you're doing.
You're trying to keep those PBC guys in the conversation, even though they're not the ones that are fighting this weekend. Canelo Alvarez and Callum Smith, they're the ones that are fighting. They're the ones getting the attention, not short guys. As far as Caleb Plant, who Canelo Alvarez already went to for a fight 2 times. You know what they got that guy doing in the near future? Caleb fucking Truax. That's what.
That's who.
You know what the story is? The first time Canelo Alvarez approached Caleb Plant for a fight, Caleb needed more time. The story now, it's a little similar, a little different. They couldn't come to an agreement. Time was an issue. Time was a constraint. But when I look at this, all I see is that Caleb Plant's team, they didn't want that fight bad enough to make sacrifices. That's what I see. That's how I see it. Because that's what these PBC fighters are good for. And you'll have shills, you'll have company guys like Marcos Villegas trying to coattail the celebrity, the success of a Canelo Alvarez and what he's about to do by name-dropping PBC fighters that already turned down the fight. Because Caleb Plant, by my count, he's already turned down his fight 2 times. David Benavidez, you can forget about that fucking guy.
Yeah, he's name-dropping Canelo too.
When what he needs to focus on is making the fucking weight. He's saying that, Canelo wasn't interested in the green belt when I was holding it. Well, when you were holding it, he was up there at light heavyweight taking care of Sergey Kovalev. He comes back down, you blow the weight, you lose the belt on the scales, the rest is history. What do you want? These guys, they're professional clout chasers. That's what they are. And Marcos Villegas, that guy's not a pundit, that guy's not a journalist, he's a company man. For Christ's sake, he's on the payroll. Of course he's gonna downplay any event that isn't a PBC event, downplay any card that isn't a PBC card, and do his best to inject PBC fighters into conversations that they're not a part of. Case in point, what the fuck does Crawford versus Spence have to do with Fury versus Joshua? And what rock are you living under that you think those fights are anywhere near each other in terms of size and scale and significance? Your own employer doesn't think enough of that fight or enough of Terrence Crawford to feature him in any of your graphics. Your own employer doesn't think that's a big fight. So what the hell are you really doing? It's what I told you. He's not mentioning that fight because he thinks Terrence Crawford is relevant or even because he thinks the fight is relevant. He's just mentioning it because it features Errol Spence Jr., a PBC fighter. He's doing his best to inject the PBC brand into a conversation that it's not a part of. That's what it is, and that's what he's doing. When people talk about Al Heyman being a cancer in the sport of boxing, this is what they're talking about. This is what punditry looks like in 2020, and this is what boxing looks like in America in 2020 as a result of Al Heyman's contribution, if that's what you want to call it. Marcos Villegas ain't got no journalistic integrity. You think it's a coincidence that this is the same Marcos Villegas that misquoted Bob Arum, saying that Bob killed the Pacquiao versus Terrence Crawford fight. That was the headline he used for the video, when that's not what Bob Arum said. Bob said, for fear of Manny's health and well-being, he'd kill that fight, but Marcos so decided to make the headline, Bob killed the fight, as if Bob prevented it from happening. Coincidence?
I think not.
Marcos Villegas is little more than just a tool, a cog in a bigger machine that is effectively ruining the sport of boxing here in the United States. That's what's going on. The fight fans are still out there, and they're still interested in fights, and what the PBC is interested in doing is preventing those fights from happening. There are those out there who would have you believe that the criticism that Al Heyman and his PBC receive is motivated by race. and politics when nothing could be further from the truth. The reason Al Heyman and his PBC receive as much criticism as they do is because they're trying to hoodwink the boxing fans and gouge them by staging these unwanted pay-per-views.
That's it.
By ignoring
the fans,
the consumer. The paying public here in America that is so obviously asking you for something, and you're determined not to give it to them. Rather, you'll dangle that fight in front of them and look to gouge them for months on end with pay-per-view after pay-per-view after pay-per-view that no one was asking you for, but that's not going to stop you from staging it. You tell me who the hell wanted to see a Luis Ortiz rematch with Deontay Wilder. And what exactly are you trying to convince me of? That the demand for a Spence versus Mikey Garcia fight was greater than the demand for a Spence versus Crawford fight? That the demand for a Spence versus Sean Porter fight was greater than the demand for the Terrence Crawford fight? I mean, here today, it really is more of the same. And this is the effect that the PBC as a company is having on the American boxing scene and how it's affecting the American boxing fan. It's not a coincidence that the sport of boxing is fading into the background of the American sporting world more and more, year by year. It's not a coincidence. Where boxing as a sport is flourishing in other parts of the world, the UK comes to mind almost immediately, as boxing has never been as big, historically, in the United Kingdom as it is today. It's bigger and better and vibrant and thriving, whereas here in America, it's fading to black. The PBC as a company, that's why. It's a big part of it. This is the state of boxing in America in 2020, where two retired fighters can stage an exhibition match that doesn't have an official outcome, and that exhibition match can bring in more pay-per-view buys than any of the PBC's cards, any one of them. Where, YouTubers are garnering more attention for their novelty fights and circus shows than an actual championship boxing match. This is the effect that the PBC is having on the American boxing scene because they're depriving the consumer of what the consumer is asking for. The consumer wants to see a Terrence Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. fight, but the PBC will have none of it. That's why they didn't feature him in their latest welterweight graphic. And that's a big part of the problem here in America.
I rest my case.